if you guys would like me to, I'd give a presentation on the women of the Bible.
That would be great.
If that sounds interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's a fascinating subject. Yeah.
So we did make it online on YouTube.
Okay.
And so let me introduce you, and then I will turn to speaker view so that you can give your presentation. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jon Jackson, who served as a psychiatrist in California for 40 years, more than 40 years, and as a Jungian psychiatrist specifically. And he's now retired, and he's done a series of 10 lectures on a psychological perspective on the Old Testament. And so this is the second of 10 lectures, and this one is going to be about the Exodus. And next time, I hope it's okay, John, 2 weeks from now, July 21st.
Yeah, I think it's work.
Okay, so on July the 21st, we will have a talk about women in the Bible, or specifically in the Old Testament. But so without further ado, let me turn the floor over to John for his talk about the Old Testament, or about the Exodus. Thank you, John, for being here.
Okay, can everybody see that?
Not yet. It hasn't started yet, but it should come up sometime soon.
I'm sharing my screen.
There it is. We have it.
Okay. Let me move this little thing out of the way. Actually, about half of my career was in California, right at the very beginning and at the end. Most of the rest of the time I was in Hawaii, which is my home state, and a little bit of time in Wisconsin as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually have seen winters, the real live winters. Okay, let's see here. Slides. Oh, come on, please work. We had a power outage here this morning, and something happened to my computer. It's just running like molasses. But it should come here. Please start the slideshow. Yeah, this is what's been happening.
Looks like you got, there you go.
Yeah. Oh my. This, see, it's not responding. Something's wrong with Windows. And I'm going to have to do a whole system check after all of this. Well, I could run through it the way it is here.
Okay, well, at the moment, we're just seeing the Zoom screen. So there it goes. Okay. Yeah, this is fine.
Okay. Let's see if it works. Okay. Well, if the slideshow decides to come up, I'll be able to make it full screen. But
good enough.
No, it's actually it's not working. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This is really bad timing, and I've never had this problem with a power outage before where it affected my computer.
Well, it's the time of year for it.
Yeah,
we did.
It was my neighbor. It was my landlord who was actually working on something next door in the house, and
there we go. There's Charlton Heston.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing that you brought up last time, where looking at MapQuest, if you go from Cairo to Jerusalem, which is further than they went to Sinai, it's a 6-day walk. So why did they take 40 years? That's it's an intriguing question, and there isn't really a great answer for it. But
well, were they in a safe place? I mean, were they able to find some place in the
I
desert
suspect
that
they were
they could hang
probably.
out?
I suspect they were probably around Midian, which is not too far from Mount Horeb, Sinai.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when Moses fled from Egypt. What it says is that he was there for 40 years as a sheep herder before he saw the burning bush.
Mm.
40 years, though, is a magical number in Hebrew, and it doesn't mean 40 years. It doesn't mean 40 anything. It just means a whole lot. A long time. Yeah. So you have a lot of things like, you know, the 40 days and nights of the flood. The one of the two flood stories says 40 days and 40 nights. The other says 150. You have the 40 years wandering. Jesus fasts for 40 days. Alibaba and the 40 thieves. You know, it's doesn't mean 40. Doesn't mean 40. But anyway, so that's my introduction, which right away alerts us. Yeah, I think I can get this to work now. It's not going to do the slideshow thing though. I don't think, unless.
Well, can you just click down the slides? Because
Yeah, here we go. It's working now. So, except it went back to the beginning. Let me draw it down here. That is going to work now, so be patient. Thank you. Okay. So, right. So this alerts us right away that there's something about the story that isn't on the level. And there's, we need to investigate that. William Propp, a well-known biblical scholar, says the story of Israel's flight from Egypt is the most important story in the Hebrew Bible. And actually, you know, when you get to the 10 commandments, there aren't just 10, you know, there's like 600 and something commandments all told. And there is a commandment before the 10 commandments, which is to celebrate the Passover. So why didn't the Bible start there? People have asked. Probably because those ancient Hebrews wanted to demonstrate that their God was in control of the universe or control of everything. But this is the story of, it's an origin story. But as Richard Elliott Friedman says, we don't even know if it really happened. And as I'll mention a little bit later, there really has been, the consensus has been split between those who say it absolutely happened just like it was told, and those who say it never happened. But Friedman is one of a number of scholars who are suggesting an alternative, which we'll talk about a little bit later near the end. So like Genesis, Exodus provides a foundation for the entire rest of the Hebrew Bible. It's the third of 4 covenants in the Bible is made with Moses and with the Israelites. You've got Abraham, you've got Jacob, you've got Moses, and you've got David, the covenant with David. Exodus can be divided into 2 main sections, the liberation and the covenant. We're going to just talk about the liberation today. And it begins with the story of 2 nations obsessed with each other and engaged in a fierce struggle for freedom and identity. I think it's a pretty well-known story. Huge film, you know, the 10 Commandments and many other versions of that. But as some scholars like to point out, Exodus itself was just the beginning. The more important part really is that Moses then takes them to Sinai, which is where the Israelites become a nation and enter into a covenant. Gods in those days were local gods. You know, we do see showing through, and we'll see this when we talk about the women, even though they tried to write it as a very patriarchal story and system, things show through. And even though this is a monotheistic document, the Hebrew Bible, old things show through. And in those days, gods were local gods. And Moses went to Sinai because Yahweh lived on a mountain. Yahweh was a mountain god. And this does continue, actually. If you step back and look at the story of Israel, where do they build the temple? They build it up on a mountain, Jerusalem, Zion. So God changes mountains, but these are the two great mountain traditions of Israel. So as we shift from Genesis to Exodus, there's a dramatic change in the storytelling. It becomes more stylized, schematic, and it starts to draw in many traditional folk elements. And it's not just this story. The ancient Hebrews were master storytellers, and they knew what a folk tale was. There are, this is where we start to have remarkable miracles in the Bible. They're all through Exodus. And we have what are called type scenes. And there are about 30 different kinds of type scenes. But when you see type scenes, what you know right away is that this is not about history. It's meant to reveal a culture and character. They're moral stories. They're like fables in a way that have a moral aspect to them, a teaching lesson. And the Hebrews, of course, everything was working toward their ultimate storytelling goal, which was to talk about a particular monotheistic God who was in control of everything and worked in history. These are a few of the type scenes, and it does apply to Exodus to a large degree. The hero leaves home. He's aided by helpers. He finds some sort of treasure. An opponent tries to thwart him. There's a mark or a brand, in some of the other stories, it's circumcision. The hero is transformed, and he returns home and he rules. Now, as opposed to the up close and personal stories that we had in Genesis, Moses and Yahweh are both seen from a distance, like the camera pulls way back for this story. And the presence of God is symbolic. He's a burning bush. He's a pillar of smoke, a pillar of fire, etc. And the man, Moses, he's referred to particularly by one of the original sources as the man Moses, does not share his inner life. We don't see him struggling within, we see him struggling without, and his qualities as a leader, except maybe right at the very end when he realizes that he's not going into the promised land. He's going to die before the Israelites, the Hebrews, get there. And he does. You get to see some of his inner struggles. The parting of the waters and other elements. This goes back to Genesis 1, the parting of the waters, dividing of the waters, the creation of the sky, and then also the crashing of the waters again brings back the story of the flood. So the writers of this particular story knew what they were saying, and they were saying this is a creation story, and it's the end of something old and the beginning of something new. One thing to point out is that slavery in the ancient world was not like slavery as we know it here in this country and elsewhere. Families were not broken up. They often owned their own property. They lived in neighborhoods. And there were very strict rules about the treatment of slaves. And this continues. The Israelites had slaves, but there were very strict rules about how long you could keep them, how hard you could work them, that you weren't allowed to abuse them. That's a different story than this one. But slaves were very common, and there were strict rules about what you could and couldn't do. So more likely this was extended forced or statute labor, known as a corvée, imposed by the state for the purpose of public works. Egypt was building cities. And I remember learning back in college, which was quite interesting, that when, at the time Abraham goes down to Egypt early on, way in the early part of the Abraham story, The pyramids were already 500 years old. So that's not what the Hebrews were involved in building. Corvée existed in ancient Egypt, Sumer, Israel. Solomon did conscripted labor when he built the temple. Ancient Rome, the Far East, and most of Western history, particularly in Europe. And the work conditions were typically pretty terrible, really bad. So even though it wasn't like the slavery that we know, it wasn't good. There's a number of questions that we have to ask about Exodus. And first we'll just talk about things to know. We have no archaeological evidence or other historical documents of any kind that support a mass exodus of Hebrews out of Egypt. Now you wouldn't expect to find it in Egypt because they destroyed things. They didn't write them down. They didn't document their failures. They wrote people out of history. So, but we don't have it elsewhere either. Likewise, there is no archaeological evidence of a mass migration into Canaan at any time in history. No time at which things there were destroyed and rebuilt. There was this constant flow and a gradual increase of people over time. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. There is evidence that there was a change in all of the Canaanite religions between 1500 and 1200 BCE, in which El, which is just a generic word for God, all of the different groups worshipped El in some one form or another. And he was defeated by a storm god. So there's a massive change in religion that happens in Canaan. And throughout the Old Testament, Yahweh is often becomes riding on a cloud, a storm cloud. So this does fit into the history that we're talking about. There also is evidence that the belief in Yahweh came from the south up to Canaan, from Sinai or from Edom or somewhere else. If you're just looking at archaeological or historical data, yes, that's also consistent with the Exodus story, that that belief came from the south up to Canaan. When did the Exodus happen? This question, somebody asked this last time as we were going through this. We don't really know for sure. That's because of the lack of historical information. The Hebrew Bible contradicts itself as to how long the Hebrews were in Egypt. In Exodus, it says 4 generations, which is about 80 years or so. In Genesis, in part of the Abraham story, they say 430 years. And either one of these fits into one or the other of the suggested stories of when it might have actually happened. The problem with 430, again, is that it's a magical number in Hebrew. And it just, from the time that of Abraham, 430 years is precisely when Solomon was building the temple. So the thinking is that they put it as 430 years because it matched that span of time and the focus was on the temple in Jerusalem. So we don't trust that number 430. Who was the Pharaoh in Egypt at the time of the Exodus? This is a good question. Some people have suggested Ramses II. And it does make sense on one level that he was Pharaoh for about 70 years and was famous for his many building projects, the cities, you know, along the Nile that we're talking about. The Hebrews worked up in the northeast part of the delta to the east of the Nile. They probably built the cities of Pithom and Ramses, according, you know, in this story. There's another theory, which is about 400 or so years older. The Hyksos took over as pharaohs in that northern delta region of the Nile around 1700 BCE, and they were Semites. And they were very friendly to Semites. They encouraged people to come there in Egypt. the original idea was that they had revolted, or that there was an invasion of the Hyksos, but in fact what probably happened is that the Semites who were living in that area grew to be so numerous that they overthrew the Egyptian pharaohs, and for a period of well, a couple of hundred years they were in charge of that region of Egypt before they were again overthrown by the Egyptians. And that's very consistent with the story that we're talking about. That's exactly, you know, the Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. Perhaps he was the Egyptian who came in to replace the Hyksos. And he's looking around and he's saying, there's so many of these Hebrews, we have to do away with them. That's very consistent with this particular story. But does it fit in history? It would have to be a story that was passed down over the years. So why does Moses have an Egyptian name? Moses means the son of in Egyptian, like Tut Moses. There is a verse in Exodus that tells you why, you know, he was taken from the water, but the thinking nowadays is that the writer of that particular passage did not know that Moses had an Egyptian name. In fact, Moses, Aaron, Miriam, and all the rest here are all Egyptian names. And as it happens, all of those people are Levites. That's an interesting fact. And it plays into the story of what the Exodus probably actually was. Exodus 2:10 is the one where they say it was because he was taken from the water, they called him Moses. So did the Exodus consist of 2 million people? In Numbers 2:32, it says 603,550 adult males, plus women and children, so about 2 million people. But what scholars have said, because of the short distance involved, if they were to walk, say, in rows of 8 from Egypt to Sinai, the first people in that group would be reaching Sinai, and the last people in that group would still be leaving Egypt. It's just too many people. The story doesn't add up in terms of what we know about the region. So in most of Western history, it has been assumed that the Bible is was historically completely accurate. That was believed until the last couple of hundred years or so. And archaeology and other ancient literature have raised questions about that, which is not a surprise now that we know more about the Hebrews, because they were not historians, they were not philosophers, they were master storytellers. And this was a time, I mean, if you look at the Bible, there are 2 different creation stories, which are separated, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. They're not the same story. If you look at the flood, there actually are 2 different flood stories woven together, and they contradict each other completely. There were 7 pairs of animals in one. There were 2 pairs, 2 pairs of 2 by 2, 7 by 7 in the 2 different stories. That's just one example. 40 days versus 150 days. That was of no concern to the Hebrews. The fact that one story contradicted another was not a concern to them. The point was, what is the story about, and what is the story trying to teach you? That was their concern, and it was their only concern. They used a lot of stories that were actually very, very old stories, 1,000 years older than they were, and retold them. Everybody who heard those stories would know those stories, but the Hebrews told them differently, and everybody would notice the differences, and that was the point they were trying to make. Christine Hayes teaches at Yale. We're dealing with sacred history, a highly embellished and theologically interpreted myth of origin. Robert Rosenthal says the story of Moses and Pharaoh applies to all of us now in the present tense. Exodus is far more than just a simple story about winning freedom. It is an allegorical portrait of the human mind. For like the Hebrews of Exodus, we have not yet reached the promised land. We have not yet reached the promised land. Jordan Peterson, the entire story is a metaphor for the psychological transformation. An old theory is no longer sufficient to account for the array of phenomena that you're now confronted with. And as a consequence, there's a dissolution of the previous system and then a state of uncertainty and chaos, and then a reconstruction. That's a psychological, that's a Piaget kind of idea about intellectual development or cognitive development. And Rabbi Yehiel Mikal, Israel's exile is always self-inflicted. Only when the Jews decide to release themselves can the demonic powers inside them be vanquished. And only then will the earthly rulers lose their power to subjugate Israel. So a lot of people feel this is a story that speaks to us today. And I'll say a little more from a Jungian perspective in just a moment. So what I'm about to present here actually is from both my first and second lectures, but I didn't talk about it before. It's a question of who actually did write the Old Testament. When and where were they written? And for whom were they written and why? And I'm going to introduce you what's called the documentary hypothesis. If you don't know about it, it comes from the 1800s. There are problems with the documentary hypothesis, other than the people that just dismiss it outright. There are questions as to when exactly did it happen? Did it happen early? Did it happen late? And then was it really just one writer? Probably not. It was probably groups of writers in a particular area, a school of writers. But Julius Wellhausen came up with this idea that there were 4 different writers of the Old Testament. J, E, D, and P. And here's a timeline. Probably the most important thing about this timeline is on the left where it says oral. These were old stories, and they pretty clearly, it's a long oral tradition. And you can tell when you get back to the Hebrew and really look at the Hebrew and understand, you hear the rhythms, you hear the chanting, you hear the songs. These stories were told for a long, long time until written language was developed, maybe 900 BCE, written language that was used. The idea is that the oldest of the documents is J, maybe comes from the time of Solomon or the Solomon school. Some interesting evidence supporting that, Solomon is supposed to have written Ecclesiastes, Kohelet. And near the end of Ecclesiastes, he talks about we are dust. We go back to dust. And he talks about the knowledge of good and evil, which is also in the J story, which is Adam and Eve, the knowledge of good and evil, and dust to dust. So yeah, some internal consistency. J, they think, this is interesting to put these things together, J, they think, was written by descendant followers of Aaron, supportive of Aaron. Whereas E, on the other hand, and D, J was in the northern part of Israel. E and D came from the southern part, Shiloh, where there was a school of Levite priests. One of them was Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah. They actually suspect Jeremiah might in fact be D, that writer who wrote Deuteronomy. And P was an Aaronid priest in the line of Aaron, who was in Judah. E is known for all these things like Aaron and Miriam criticize Moses because he's married a foreigner. The golden calf story, which was Aaron, was the one who did that. He melted down all the people's jewelry and created the golden. There's all those stories about how bad Aaron was, were all written by E. And P was pro-Aaron. And so that's where you get these things. He's trying to correct the text where he says, and God spoke to Moses and Aaron, and God this and Aaron. So you see that there are these different streams. They all came together it all seems to be around the time of the Babylonian exile, which makes a good deal of sense because they're living in a foreign land, they're living under a foreign religion, they're acclimatizing, they're becoming part of the culture, and the priests don't want Israel to forget where they came from and who they are and what their stories are. Tradition says, we don't know how true this is, but tradition says that Ezra, the prophet Ezra, actually carried the Torah back with him from Babylon to Israel at the time of the end of the captivity. It's probably sort of true, and maybe wasn't really, that person, because some of the documents did come from earlier, and some of them did come from later. Remember, there was the split after Solomon. There were a couple of kings, and then the kingdom split, and the top part, the kingdom of Israel, were the followers of Aaron, and they had this idea you didn't have to go to Jerusalem and worship at the temple. You could worship up here, and they even had some suspicious idol-like things, that maybe another golden calf. So they say up there in the kingdom of Israel, and in the south, the two tribes that were down in the south, the kingdom of Judah, were the Levites, at least, well, they both were Levites, but the Moses Levites were the ones that were down south. And of course, the reason that the northern kingdom was defeated was because they didn't worship at the temple, right? That's how
Can you explain the difference between the Levites and the Semites? What was their origin in Egypt?
That's a good question. As to how they got there in the first place, well, to whatever extent the Abraham story is true, they probably had been there for a very long time. But they were a particular tribe. They actually were the 13th tribe. They didn't. They existed kind of independent from the other tribes. And
okay, so this is the 12 tribes of Israel we're talking about, but then there was the 13th,
and 10 of them were destroyed by the Assyrians when they destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. And so there were only 2 tribes left down in the south, and those 2 tribes were defeated by Babylon and taken into captivity. Though not everyone went to Babylon, and of course, not everybody came back from Babylon. Not everybody came out of Egypt. There was a huge Jewish community in Egypt, in Alexandria, for instance, many years later. This is looking at it again, and again, what this slide shows us is that the documents seem to correspond to the Iron Age, and the Iron Age is the period of time which these massive inner empires, first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, are trying. They come out. They're trying to get a passage to the coast. They're trying to have land that borders on the ocean, and they come and they defeat Israel. They defeat whoever's in their way. And that's during the Iron Age. And again, that makes sense that these documents would come from about the time of the Babylonian captivity. If you look at these, we're not looking at D here, but we're looking at J, E, and P, and then the redactor, or the editor, the one who actually put these things together. This is what it looks like. If you look, this is how it was woven together. The redactor was an absolutely brilliant person or school of people. Just amazing the way these stories were put together, using these 3 old sources and some additional other sources that we don't know what they were. This is looking at Exodus alone, which is our topic today, and how these stories. Blue is P, who was the priestly one who was really into the rituals and the rules and the covenant and the instructions. And so out at Sinai, you can see that those whole long portions there, which have to do with the covenant and the 600 different commandments, etc. And this is how it looks. This is the crossing of the Red Sea. Exodus 14, you can see how those sources were woven together. And if you actually sit and read the document, you'll see how it tells the story. It goes back, it tells the story a little differently. And if you read it through line by line. So if you want to know more about this, this is a good, easy to understand source by really Richard Elliott Friedman, who wrote the Bible. And he goes into exactly all the things I've just been talking about. So much of the Torah was likely written in Judah during the 8th to 6th centuries BCE by multiple authors in disconnected stages. Multiple lines of evidence point to this, including many anachronisms, like the descriptions of places all through the Old Testament are descriptions of what it looked like at the time of Babylon. They're not descriptions of what it would have looked like at the time of Abraham. Also camels, they didn't use camels way back then, and yet camels are in the story. There's a number of anachronistic things like that. Parts of the Torah may have been later. Tradition identifies the Torah or Pentateuch as being written by Moses himself, dictated or inspired by God. There are problems with that idea, but the redactor or the editor is basically in that same role. The role that has traditionally been assigned to Moses is the role of the redactor who put this story together. It's either a school or a person. We don't know for sure. Jungian analyst Murray Stein equates the work of that redactor to the work of the ego. When you are recounting a dream, let's say, or a fantasy or some other liminal experience that you've had, the ego produces the narrative, which is more coherent and more organized than the experience itself. And it's a step away from the experience. And this can stand in the way of deeper understanding because it's not the experience. So it's important to recognize, and this is where we get into the bias of the redactor, the patriarchy and other things like that, the monotheism of the redactor. That was what was emphasized. And it's important, says Murray, what was repressed in the telling. Time and space are not absolute in the unconscious, nor is cause and effect. It's the ego that adds that perspective. But the most important thing actually is the story in its final form, because that's the archetypal story. It's fascinating and it's powerful. So we can follow the images and the symbols. We see how they relate, how they differ, and how they evolve. Stein also suggests that we, as readers, become part of the drama imaginatively, use active imagination, have a dialogue with the text, bring all of you to the interaction, especially your experience, your dreams, your feelings, become passionately involved, and allow transference or countertransference, allow that to build up in you, and trust your reactions, examine your feelings. How do your dreams fill in the missing parts? It's an interesting approach, I think. So what he says about this is that there are no right or wrong interpretations. There are only strong and weak interpretations, persuasive or confusing interpretations. And remember that a depth psychological approach is always subversive to anything that is finished. Depth psychology and the unconscious doesn't like finished things. It's always in a process of becoming. Edward Edinger, also a Jungian analyst, says the encounter between Moses and Yahweh is one of the grandest individuation dramas of the Western psyche. I think that's the opening line of the Bible and the psyche. Something new is emerging from the unconscious, demands attention. The character of Moses personifies the urge to individuate. He goes through an experience of exile, alienation, receives help from the lowly aspects of the psyche, the 10 plagues, which are open to the transpersonal dimension. His encounters with Yahweh are encounters with the self. Crossing the Red Sea is a transition to a new level of consciousness. So the writers of Exodus deliberately created the link with Genesis. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each man with his household. They came 70 persons. That's a magical number. But Joseph was in Egypt. So you remember the story of how Joseph, the coat of many colors, who was kind of a jerk, was sold into slavery by his brothers, and that he rose to power down in Egypt. Was that the Hyksos? You know, they liked Semites down there. And then they all of them came down because of the drought, because of the famine up north. Years pass, Joseph dies, and all of his brothers and that generation, the sons of Israel, were fruitful and swarmed and multiplied and grew very vast. And the land was filled with them, and a new king arose over Egypt who knew not Joseph. And the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, when you deliver the Hebrew women and look on the birth stool, if it is a boy, you shall put him to death. And the midwives, there are two of them, and this is one of the magical elements in the story, two midwives are serving thousands of women who are giving birth. Midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had spoken to them, and they let the children live. So like so many stories in the Old Testament, they ultimately are about the men, but they begin with the women. Remember, Rebecca conspires to have Jacob win, the blessing from Isaac, and that's just one of many stories where the woman is the one who actually made the thing happen, and that's also true in this story. And a man from the house of Levi went and took a Levite daughter, and the woman conceived and bore a son, and she hid him for 3 months. Again, I'm going to point out that we're talking about Levites in Egypt. And when she could no longer hide him, she took a wicker ark for him and caulked it with resin and pitch, placed the child in it, placed it in the reed, it should say reeds, by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to see what would be done. So there it's corrected. Now there's two things to point out here. First of all is the use of the word ark. She took a wicker ark for him, and that is the word teva. There's only 2 times in the Old Testament that ark appears, and the other one is in the flood story. So I believe, scholars believe, that that's a deliberate use of the word ark to link it to the flood story. And likewise, reeds suggests the Red Sea actually was not the Red Sea. Some people think it was the Reed Sea, and the fact that he's put in the reeds, that would be consistent with the fact that he escapes through the Reed Sea. And I want to point this out, and I'll point it out again. This is some of the evidence about oral storytelling. This is something that the Hebrews did, and most of the English translations have not brought this through. They thought it was repetitive and annoying and whatnot. This is Robert Alter's translation, but this is what the Hebrews did, and it's there, and it's all through Genesis, it's all through Exodus, it's all through the storytelling. These sentences are little segments, and they all start with the word and. And a man from the house of Levi went and took a Levite daughter, and the woman conceived, and bore a son, and she hid him for 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took a wicker ark for him, and caulked it with resin and pitch, and placed it, the child in it, and placed it in the reeds by the banks. You see, you get the idea. It's a rhythm there. This is some of the evidence, I think, that this was oral storytelling, or chanting, or singing. It's very compelling when you actually see it. Now, one thing to say about this story of Moses is it is a retelling of a much older story. Once again, the Hebrews are using an old story to tell a new one. the story of Sargon of Akkad. He's the first person in history known to rule a kingdom. He's the one, he was even before some of the ancient, even before Sumer. He conquered Sumer. As a baby, he was protected by women and was floated down the river in a reed basket. So it's a well-known story, but it has a difference, which is what the Hebrews were all about. Then Pharaoh's daughter comes down to bathe in the Nile. She sees the ark in the midst of the reeds and sent her slave girl and took it. She opened it up and saw the child, and she pitied him. And then the sister says, shall I go get someone to nurse the baby? And she goes and gets Moses' mother. So he's raised by his mother in the palace as part of the royal family. It's a very interesting story. And then there's a big blank spot. We're told nothing of Moses' childhood. And something similar, happens with Jesus, if you remember. Pilate, not Pilate, but, the local king is going to have all children up to 2 years old killed. They escape to Egypt, and then we don't hear anything for many, many years. And I think that's a linking of that story with the story of Moses. As an adult, he kills an Egyptian for abusing a Hebrew slave, and then he flees to Midian, where he lives as a sheep herder for 40 years. He gets married to a foreigner. They have 2 sons. And then I mentioned this before, Aaron and Miriam are later criticized Moses for being married to a foreigner. Possibly she was black. That's another possible interpretation of that word. And remember, I pointed out before that all of those negative Aaron stories are all written by the source E. So after a long time passed, I believe some versions say 40 years, had passed, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned from the bondage and cried out, and their plea for the bondage went up to God. Moses is herding his flock. He drives the flock out into the wilderness. He goes to Horeb, which is Mount Sinai. Different sources, one source calls it Horeb, the other source calls it Sinai. And the Lord's messenger appears to him in a flame of fire from the midst of the bush. And he saw, and look, the bush was burning with fire and the bush was not consumed. So the small capitals on Lord is convention for Yahweh. So this is the appearance of Yahweh now. Again, using this and storytelling. And God, Moses says, after he's heard all this stuff, he says, look, when I come down to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God says to Moses, I will be who I will be, or I am who I am, or I cause to be what I will cause to be. The Hebrew did not have past tense. It only had things that are currently happening and things that are in the process of becoming. And this combines the two, actually. I believe this is the only time in religious literature, religious documents, where God speaks this way. It's the first person, present and future, and pertains to being. I am, I will be. And the roots of that actually, that the phrase that's used to translate actually is very closely related to the name Yahweh. And then another source says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So you could say that Moses this is something maybe showing through again, that Moses is saying, well, which God are you? And then possibly, some scholars have said, maybe what God is doing here is not telling Moses his name. The Hebrews had this thing about naming things. There are things that they wouldn't, they wouldn't in the Genesis story name the sun and the moon. They called it the big light and the small light because those were pagan gods. And anything that, Adam is given the power to name things. you have kind of an ownership of things when you can name them. So is God perhaps not giving Moses his name, but is saying something about himself? People have wondered that. Pharaoh in Exodus also is not named. And sometimes I think in the E source, he's just called the king of Egypt. But he was considered divine. And so this contest between Moses and Pharaoh is really a conflict between two gods. And it's not clear why the ancient Hebrew chose to have 10 plagues, because none of the original sources has 10 plagues. J has 8, E has 3, P has 5, but most likely it's the pattern. Things are really structured in the Hebrew documents. For instance, in Genesis 1, there are the 6 days of creation, but it's actually 2 sets of 3 that have a repeating pattern. And another time, perhaps we'll talk about that. But here they think that this is 3 sets of 3, and then the final 10th plague, just like there were 2 sets of 3, and then the 7th day in Genesis. And the 10th plague was the death of all firstborn humans and animals. In each set of 3, the first 2 plagues are forewarned, the third is not. The first one tells the time of day of the plague, the second one begins with go to Pharaoh, and the third one has no introduction. And that pattern repeats in each set of 3. So that's probably why there are 10 plagues. And here they are. First one has to do with water. Just like a lot of things in Exodus have to do with water. The frogs, the gnats, the flies, the livestock, illness, boils, hail and fire, locusts, darkness, and then the death of the firstborn. So Passover has its origin during the 10th plague. You kill the paschal lamb, you paint the sill outside your door with the blood, and you have your bread with no yeast in it, no leaven, unleavened bread. That begins here in Exodus. This is the Passover. And what's unique about it in terms of nation building, people making, is that Passover becomes a nation ritual. And it differs from all other nature rituals in the area. And those would be, you would sacrifice the firstborn lamb, or you would sacrifice the first harvest of barley before it could ferment. But these rituals are combined in the Passover story, and it becomes a nation ritual. It also reveals that there are different kinds of people that made up Israel. Some of them were farmers, and some of them were nomads. But it all came together to be one. So when we talk about the crossing of the Red Sea, the Red Sea was not called the Red Sea at the time of Exodus, for one thing. And when we look at that, there are 3 different accounts of the crossing that are all woven in together. I showed you this before. This is what it looks like if you look at how they were woven together. In J, the Egyptians are defeated by their own chariots in the marsh. They get stuck in the mud. In E, there's an east wind that blows the sea back and creates dry land. And in P, Moses raises his staff, the waters divide, there's dry land, and then the waters crash down again. And as I said before, these are references to the creation. Just to go through all 3 again in terms of how the stories are the same and how they're different. All of them talk about Egypt oppresses the Israelites. J has baby Moses in the basket. Moses flees Egypt. There's the burning bush. There's Yahweh and the 10 commandments. E, Moses is called in Midian. He's Abraham's God, and I am. And the actual Passover happens in the E document. And the Song of the Sea, or the Song of Miriam, which they sing on the other side after they've crossed the Red Sea, is in the E document. But it's also it's probably the oldest thing in the Bible. It's an old poem. and E incorporates it. And then the golden calf story, of course, is in E, making Aaron look bad. In P, that's Moses's life in Egypt, God's name, again, Yahweh. P is the one that talks about manna in the desert, the food. In P, you're commanded to celebrate the Passover. And P, of course, the priestly documents, the covenant, an extended set of rules and regulations and laws. I mentioned the Song of the Sea. And in the Song of the Sea, God's wind piles up the waters and then drowns Pharaoh's chariots. But there's no mention of anyone crossing. It's simply that God was so powerful, he delivered us from our enemy. All through the Old Testament, ancient Hebrews frequently used sinking in deep waters as a metaphor for deep emotional distress. They were not seafaring people, they were land people, and they didn't like the water. There were monsters in the water. And they used it in their poetry as a symbol for distress. So until recently, the consensus in Exodus has largely been split between those who say it happened just as reported versus those who say it never happened, it's entirely made up. There is considerable evidence now which suggests the Hebrews who became Israel were actually indigenous to Canaan. Some really fascinating clues about that, one of which is that the large group of people that were there didn't eat pork. There are no pork bones found in their archaeological sites. It's thought by some that there was a much smaller exodus out of Egypt that did occur, consisting only of the tribe of Levi, or the Levites. These people were monotheists, and they became the priests of the other tribes of Israel, who were either polytheists at the time, or they worshiped a different god than Yahweh, El. And you do see that a lot of the documents do refer to El, who then becomes Yahweh. And in Exodus, it's clearly stated, I was El, now I'm Yahweh. This is a book you can read if you want to. It's a really fun book. It's also available in audio, The Exodus by Richard Elliott Friedman. This is a really fascinating thing about the book of Exodus, or about the Exodus. And the Lord God, or it actually is Lord God, Yahweh, spoke to Moses saying, and you shall love your fellow man as yourself. It's found in Leviticus 19:1, but the truth is, it's mentioned 52 times in the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Bible. You shall love your fellow man. You shall not abuse the alien that is in your land, because you were alien and slaves in another land. 52 times. The text is probably an old one from Judah after the Assyrians conquered and destroyed the 10 northern tribes in Israel. Again, we're talking about the priest in Shiloh, probably. Jesus quotes this text when he's asked by the Pharisees and the Sadducees to summarize the law. The second one is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no law greater than this one. Israelites were commanded to give equal treatment because they were once slaves. 52 times it's mentioned. There's nothing else in the Torah that's mentioned anywhere near that many times. It's an emphasis that's unique in the Hebrew law codes. As one source I read said, it's found 52 times in the entire religious literature of the entire area through all time, and it's all in the Hebrew Bible. You shall love your fellow man as yourself. It comes from the Levites. This and monotheism are the 2 lasting legacies that come from the book of Exodus. And that's what I'm going to present today.
Wow. Very interesting. a lot of good stuff here.
A lot of fascinating stuff that happens in the second part of the story. You know, really a liminal experience in the desert. You know, they've gone from Egypt, now they're out in the wilderness, and amazing things happen all along the way. And there's a lot to talk about there, which is really quite fascinating.
Yeah, one of the things that has interest me here is how Dr. Jung talked about these stories as psychological transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And you may have noticed that I was yawning and so on while you were talking, and that was no reflection on you, but I mean, I was trying to hide it. Maybe I hope I hid it successfully. But what I find, if I'm listening to anybody about any scriptural story,
Mm-hmm.
is, and this includes in Protestant sermons, it is included in Tibetan Buddhist talks. Whenever I go and hear somebody talk, it just knocks me out.
Mm.
And it, you know, it's not because I'm so tired, but somehow these stories, which are archetypal, evidently, are, you know, they somehow stretch my psyche in such a way that it just makes me want to rest, or either that or to take the information in subliminally.
What you're referring to is the archetypal nature of the stories, right? And you know, that is the thing that matters about these stories. It doesn't matter if it actually is history or if it's not. They're
Right.
archetypal stories that speak to the soul.
Right, and this was Jung's point, that every religious story of whatever kind is a story of the psyche, and therefore they're all true.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right.
You know, one thing you're reminding me, it's in the second half again, but out at Sinai, and it's during this time when the golden calf thing is going on, and God loses his temper, and Moses calms him down, and then later Moses loses his temper, and God calms him down. It's actually a kind of an interchange that has some echoes, or you know, it seems like a lot like Job.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Moses changes God's mind about stuff, and vice versa. And it's an interesting aspect of the story that I hadn't really thought about before, until recently. You know, looking at Answer to Job, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
Skip,
Yes, go ahead.
to me that one important thing to remember is when the Jewish people are referred to as storytellers, that should not be interpreted as meaning that a group of unknown, anonymous Jewish men got together and simply made up these stories, any more than the story of Christ was made up by a group of Jews who became Christians. Despite the things we cannot prove historically, or the anachronisms, or the apparent contradictions, Exodus in the Old Testament is still a holy book, and it's an expression of divine revelation to individual personages, and divine revelations to the Hebrew people as a whole. And it was not consciously made up by any human being or association of human beings. It was an expression of Yahweh through the human soul of Hebrew individuals and the Hebrew nations. No religion that was just made up consciously by a group of men making up and telling stories could possibly have endured for so many thousands of years. And the Hebrew people individually and as separate citizens and families dispersed throughout a large part of the planet would not have adhered to it for so long. It's important to remember that the Old Testament is not just a document to be looked at through the eye of the intellect, but also to be accepted emotionally as a revelatory document.
Yeah, I think that's well said. You know, with reference to the historicity, for a long time, there was no other document anywhere that mentioned King David. It was in the same situation that we're in with Exodus. We didn't have anything. There was no evidence to support it. And a lot of scholars were thinking, well, you know, maybe David wasn't real. Maybe it didn't really happen. Well, we know now that he was real. And we do have records from other countries, other civilizations that had interactions with King David of Israel. So all the fact that there's no evidence just means we haven't found anything. Yeah, the lack of evidence is not proof, I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, I think that what is compelling is the Bible itself as evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
yeah,
right, and
that's actually in the 20th century really that scholars actually started looking at the text itself for internal evidence, which I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, and you were talking about how God and Moses had this interplay, mm-hmm. and there's this quote in Answer to Job, Dr. Jung's book, in paragraph 617, where he's talking about the interplay between Yahweh and Job, and Job realizes that Yahweh has two sides, you know, a reasonable side and you better fear me side, so I'll just read what Jung says about that. Yahweh has to remember his absolute knowledge, for if Job gains knowledge of God, then God must also learn to know himself. It just could not be that Yahweh's dual nature should become public property and remain hidden from himself alone. Whoever knows God has an effect on him. The failure of the attempt to corrupt Job has changed Yahweh's nature. And you know, I don't know how hard to hit on this, but what Edinger was saying in his book about the Bible from a psychic point of view was that before Job, these stories are a collective story, a story about a tribe that is getting along with a certain amount of participation mystique, I think. And after Job, it becomes a story about individuation, about individuals. In other words, after Job, we have many individuals, Ezekiel, Daniel, a bunch of others. Whereas before Job, it's a story of a people. So it's a change in consciousness. So the question is, you know, I accept that all these things are true as psychic facts, 100%. The Bible is true, 100% in that respect, and it's somewhat true from a historical perspective, although the record keeping wasn't so hot, so therefore the historicity before I don't know when historians started to keep really good records, but that part is sort of loosey-goosey. But what we know is that this is an experience of all of us. It's not an experience of only these people who lived 3,000 years ago. It's an experience of each one of us. I mean, would you concur with that?
I do agree that it's a universal story. In fact, I'm reading here, Maxie Purrington put up, we must read this is a quote from Jung, we must read the Bible or we shall not understand psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Our psychology, whole lives, our language and imagery are built upon the Bible. Now,
Right.
This actually picks up something that this is a question that I wonder about a lot. And when I look at myself and what I know, so far about what's in me, because I do believe that that's very true of Western culture. That quote from Jung and what you just said also.
Mm-hmm.
For myself, I was raised in Hawaii, barefoot in Hawaii, in the Hawaiian culture, Asian influences. I was not brought up with religion. I was not brought up with the Bible. I was not brought up with Greek mythology. And that stuff came later, but it's not the deepest stuff in my soul. And I wonder, Jung was what now, 100 years ago in German-speaking Switzerland.
Mm-hmm.
That's not where I grew up. Those aren't the images that are in my head, the deepest ones. So I wonder about that. I mean, I think in terms of the processes and the basic structure and the dynamics of what goes on, I think that's very true. I think perhaps individual people have different images to work with. And
let me make a comment to our YouTube audience. There has been a comment which I hid from the chat, and where people are using improper language, I'm not accepting that as an appropriate chat. I'm sorry. Even people who have been here a long time should know that that's not acceptable on this channel. I'm sorry to interrupt. Yes, go ahead.
I would point out, first of all, that Dr. Jung wasn't just 100 years ago in Switzerland. He was also living and writing some of his most prolific work while at least 5 of us were living.
Yes.
So, Copernicus lived 350 years ago or more, and that doesn't diminish the fact that he discovered that the Earth revolves around the sun. So I don't think when a person lives, it's not necessarily a handy-dandy gauge to gauge the efficacy of their legacy. I would also point out that in the Red Book, Dr. Jung refers to Philo the Jew who lived in Alexandria during a great age of learning that was centered in Alexandria, and credited Philo the Jew for the use of the word logos. But Philo the Jew was a most prolific writer. He wrote a book entitled On the Creation, and it's his interpretation of not just the creation, but the 5 books of Genesis, including Exodus. And in Exodus, his interpretation is that when Adam, and by Adam I mean man with a capital letter before the creation of Eve, when Adam was created, God endowed him with mind, and that the story of Exodus was the story of mind trying to flee the body, which in his interpretation of Exodus was Pharaoh, or the god of Pharaoh. And the entire story of Exodus, in which not only each character but each city, town, village, place is given an interpretation referring to a quality of the human soul. For example, Sarah is referred to as perseverance, and her relationship with all the characters around him are discussed in terms of the relationship as psychic qualities. And this is really the living embodiment of the human soul. And so I think that I would recommend anybody to try to read Philo. The Jewish collected works are not copyrighted. They're readily available on the internet. His writing style is really hard.
John, do you have that available to you? Because if not, I can make it available.
I don't. I'd like to have it.
Yes.
Okay.
And I mean, you need to make intellectual commitment to persevere through the hard writing, and you need to make a moral commitment that you'll read it with an open heart. But it's so much better than looking at through the Faustian lens of the intellect and cutting every word and story apart. Read in the fashion of Philo the Jew makes it come alive. If I wanted to read simply something of dry academic interpretation, I can pull out my old algebra book and read that. So anyway, that's what I have to say on that.
Right. Well, what I wanted to also say is that this same sort of thing has happened around the world, and the proof of that, among other things, is the Bhagavad Gita, which I've been reading with our friend Kushbu, and I actually never connected with the Bhagavad Gita until May the 9th of this year. And what happened was that when I received my first copy of it, which I hadn't even really heard of it for maybe 50 years, even though I had made many, many trips to India, you know, I obviously it sort of washed past me a lot of times because I spent a couple of years in India over a long period of time. And, but when I actually did look at it, I said, oh my God, this is comparable to Jungian psychology. And the story, the way that story is put together is a story of psychological development and individuation and how you face life, how you get a life, all those sorts of things. You know, it's, well, it seems to me, I mean, that's my perception of it. And I've now gotten to the discourse in which God is revealing himself. You know, Shiva through Krishna is revealing himself as it, let's say. and you know, I have no exceptions from that. I mean, in a sense, it's easier than the Old Testament in terms of pointing a finger and saying, yeah, this is what we need to do, and this is what we have been doing, and this is what it happens in both Jungian psychology and Christianity and Judaism and Islam. All these things are of a piece, in a sense. Now, I don't know that my Sanskrit scholar friends will go along with that, but that's my story, and I'm sticking with it because, you know,
Well, Skip?
Yes, go ahead.
Actually, I think quite right, because Dr. Jung always referred to or had the belief that the earth was a living body.
Right.
That it had a soul.
Right.
What made up the soul was all of the human egos, past, present, that would be in the future, constituted the soul of the earth. Because the way we think is the same way that the earth thinks. So that it sounds contradictory, but religions can be different, but placed together, they can create a cohesive and whole fabric.
Yeah.
That's why I've always believed that, sure, the West in general is extroverted and the East is introverted, because that's the way human beings are. So the fact that the Mother Earth is split between introvert and extrovert makes all the sense in the world to me.
Truly.
See, I wanted to mention that one of the things I've been thinking about in terms of the story of the Exodus is just the parallel with the life cycle of a person. You know, growing up in this restricted environment of childhood and breaking out of that in the teenage years and you know, going off to search for the secret and having to go through the wilderness of individuation before finally coming to the cusp of the promised land. I'm thinking of it in terms of individual development that way. I'm sure you've thought of this before, John, but it was a new idea for me.
I certainly think that's right. And you know, because as you rightly say, Tim, I mean, we all have to break away from Pharaoh, the slave driver, and go become what we will become, and we have to face our life and maturity as individuals. We have to break away from the group enough, what we've been talking about a bit recently, including Monday night, is we have to break away from the group enough to make our own mark, enough to make our own tile on the great mosaic of life. How are we affecting that? Okay, I'm just looking at some other, but you know, I find the same in. Well, this is about the Old Testament, so I'm not going to go into the New Testament. But you know, obviously, you know, Moses. There's so many parts of the Moses story. One is creating the law, and the idea that there would be written down laws, whether there were 600 or 10, isn't really the issue. The issue is, will your society live by the rule of law or not? And in a society like the Roman emperors ran, everybody had to do what the Roman emperor wanted, my way or the highway. and so so they did have to, we as a human species had to, if we were going to live happily within each of our homes. Okay, in other words, there's not all of us can live in Buckingham Palace, but all of us can learn to live in our own kingdom if we learn to mature as human beings in a way that recognizes the need to develop a family and raise that family in a mature and responsible way, and bring the next generation up so that they will do so. And that's taking on responsibility, as Jordan Peterson says. You have to carry a load, and you have to pick up a load and carry it. And the reason we have so many nihilistic young men right at the moment is that those are all people who don't want to take up a load. The way to put meaning into your life is to get one, right? You can't sit at home and expect your mom and dad to pay your college bills and think you're gonna, mom's gonna make breakfast, lunch, and dinner for you all the time. The purpose of growing up is to grow up so that you mature and take a responsibility in society. Seems to me. I mean, I'm just yammering here, but are there other people here besides Tim and me that want to speak to these issues? Nancy, do you have?
Well, I was just thinking, Jung used to talk not only about a person going through individuation, but a culture. I'm wondering if, John, if you see the story of Genesis through the end of the Hebrew Bible as the individuation of a culture.
Yes, yeah. In fact, that's Murray Stein's approach. In his the book is called "The Bible as Dream," but it was a series of lectures that he gave at the Jung Institute in Chicago back in the 80s, I believe. But that's his idea: is that it's one long story that is the individuation of a nation, and also individuation of an individual, archetypally. But yeah, I do believe that cultures do go through those kinds of changes.
And it's ongoing. It never stops.
That is one of the great things is that the Bible isn't just a group of people in one location at one period of time. It's thousands of years of deep archetypal stuff, And,
I mean, we're seeing it in current events right now, where the new generation is growing up. I mean, our generation, John, we had this growing up period during the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, and all of us had to grow up in a certain way, and things did improve for the Black community at that time quite noticeably, and yet certain forces have pushed them back to the point where now the society has to grow up again. It's been forced backward by new generations that didn't go through those things, and so now they're having
a rude awakening that we thought that had all been done before, but no.
Yeah, it has to be done with every person in every generation, because we're born as wild animals, and we have to learn how to be responsible in society and have a society that will be responsible for the things that we can't control. For example, public health. We as individuals find it hard to control our public health needs, and so therefore we call upon our governments to do that. And when they don't do it, then that's an issue. And so, you know, we are very definitely going through this collective growing up period now that older people are familiar with. We've been through the drill at least once before, that younger people are not and don't take seriously yet. You know, there's the old saying, the young will be served often on silver platters.
Mm.
So, okay. Thank you, John. This has been a wonderful discussion. We've had a good discussion also in the chat on YouTube, and we can have access to that later.
Good.
And so you're prepared to do another lecture with us about women in the Bible?
Yeah.
In 2 weeks' time. Okay. So that'll be the
pretty remarkable individuals, actually starting with Eve.
Indeed. And how about Lilith? Have you addressed Lilith?
In my first lecture, which the part of it I did not give here, I do talk about Lilith.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because there's
the great lengths that religious people have gone to, because, you know, there's male and female are created in Genesis 1, and then there's a different story in Genesis 2. So who was that first woman, if there was one? Well, Lilith is an interesting version of that, but other people think no, that or at least old thinkers thought that actually male and female, that it was created in one body, and then in Genesis 2 it was split in half, so it's basically an intersex. And you know, I think it was actually Augustine that put an end to that. I think he said, no, I don't like that idea.
Well, there two women who I've interacted with at a distance for a decade now. I think their book is called In Praise of Lilith. And I'll make sure I find the book, because they're still quite active, and I see them both on on Twitter.
Actually, you know, I can ask a question here, because I'm curious. I was not familiar before I started reading up on all this stuff, but apparently in some cultures, I don't know if it's more in the past or if it still goes on now, but families on the baby crib will take yellow ribbon and put it around the outside of the crib to keep Lilith from coming to steal their children. Has anyone heard of that before, or know anyone who did that? It's a curious custom, isn't it? She was a child killer, or a child kidnapper.
Well, I'll see if I can get more access to that, because I'm sure these two women who wrote this book together would love to interact with you about it. And so I will give them a heads up that you're going to speak on this issue.
I'll just, as a preview, I'll just say, women in the Bible were and did hold every position of authority, including being a prophet, except for being a priest. That was the one thing they weren't allowed to do. They were judges. But on the other hand, to put it in a larger perspective, the only people that could be priests were Levites anyway. So 90% of males couldn't have been priests in Israel. So, but anyway, that's the one exception, that women are depicted in every other role, including queen.
Skip?
Yes.
There's a similar situation at the time of Alexander the Great, because in antiquity, many times a prophetess ranked higher than a priest.
Yes.
For
In the
example,
time of the judges, I think this was
correct.
true also.
Sure.
Because when
Yeah.
Alexander needed advice, he didn't go to a priest of any kind. He went to the temple at Delphi and consulted the priestess there.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting that it was mentioned that the Jews were not a seafaring people because they were afraid of the monsters, the stories of the monsters. Yet on
Yeah.
the other hand, the Greeks were great seafaring people and told stories about monsters all the time.
Sure did.
Right. And those Delphi priestesses held forth for some incredible amount of time, like 1,500 years. There's a recent documentary about Delphi that's very, very interesting.
Yeah.
And makes me want to go back to Greece and spend more time because I didn't pay enough attention to that one. And
Yeah. There's a lot about that in like Marie Renaud's books.
mhm.
And I believe you see it in the Iliad and in the Odyssey as well. It's
Right.
a fascinating bit of history. Yeah.
Right. So another tradition of crossover, I just want to put in a little plug for our Saturday night conversation this coming Saturday night, which will be 7 p.m. Pacific time, and it'll be 10 p.m. Eastern time, regretfully, but we're going to have a Sanskrit expert who's written about the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and and Dr. Jung gave several lectures about the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali during the late 1930s, and those, when I send out the notice for Saturday night again, I will include the links for that, so that if you want to read up, because I think what many people in the West have now understood is that meditation is an important way to connect with the self or with the personal God image. And so yoga is only peripherally about exercise, although it's largely seen as exercise in the West, because the way it's sneaked into the West is through gyms. So Debbie and I used to go to yin yoga classes, and I said, wow, we have yoga teachers in Nebraska, and oh, by the way, this is really Eastern philosophy that they're teaching, because they're not just teaching you the positions and the moves of yoga, but they're also putting the philosophy into it. And what I have found in the last few weeks, since I discovered all this Sanskrit stuff that was a whole area that I had not opened up before, is that there are many things here that are relevant. So relevant to our lives in terms of this yoga. And one of the things that I've been doing for 25 years is doing Tibetan Buddhist meditation. Doesn't mean I'm trying to become a Buddhist Lama or anything like that, but my wife actually did complete a 3-year retreat in Tibetan Buddhism. But I have never found anything that is better than this book by, let's see if I can get it at the right. Okay, there it is. This book by Melissa Townsend, called The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And what she's done is taken each sutra and created an image that relates to that sutra. And what I found just by reading through the book is that suddenly it's taking me through depths of meditation that I have never reached in Tibetan Buddhist meditation based on my Tibetan Buddhist teaching. And not only is it taking me through it, but it's quite memorable as well. And I know that because I am familiar with Japanese and Chinese, what I've learned is that the pictographs of Japanese and Chinese, they come out of the right brain, whereas phonetic language comes from the left brain. And that's been evidenced by experiences with stroke victims in
Yeah, I think
Japan.
that's absolutely correct. Yeah.
Right. And so what I find Melissa Townsend's book doing for me is activating my right brain in ways that it was never activated before, with the sort of verbal phonetic teaching of the Tibetan Buddhist monks. Never quite did it for me. And I made this comment to my wife, and she said, "Oh yeah, but there's lots of imagery and vision, images in Tibetan Buddhist meditation." And I say, "Okay, yeah, but those are, very typically, they're very complex images that connect to 2,500-year-old Tibetan Buddhist God images that were very complex, and they're sort of foreign. I find them rather foreign to me. I mean, I think they're cute and interesting and so on, but anyway."
Skip?
Yes.
One interesting thing, apart from the role the brain and the right-left hemispheres play in our thinking, is also, it's often referred to that poetry, particularly love poetry, does not come from the brain at all, but rather from the heart.
Yes.
I would suspect all of the organs of the body present images to us.
So in any case, this has been a plug for Melissa Townsend's session with us, which is Saturday night, and it starts at 7 p.m. Pacific time, 8 p.m. Mountain time, and 9 p.m. Central time, 10 p.m. Eastern time, and also 10 a.m. in Singapore for those that are interested, and noon in Sydney. So it's going to reach a big piece of the world, and it's going to be a very interesting session. And Melissa's going to talk to us about her project. She's now got 2 volumes out. There are 195 sutras of the Pentanjali, and she's done the first half of them. So she's got 1/4 in each of the first 2 volumes, and she's got half of the project to go. So it'll be very interesting to hear about her project. So thank you so much, John.
Thank you. And I'll see you again soon, I hope. Yeah.
Yes. See you in 2 weeks. Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you again soon.
Judith, it was good to see you here.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks, John. Great to be here.
Thank you all for being here.
Okay,
Peace.
bye.
Go ahead. I haven't hit the button yet.
If you could repost, I don't know if you got what I put in the chat, but I would like to be included for the Saturday night seminar if possible. I don't know how to do that. I don't know if I have to do that through John, but
no, you can just put your email address on the chat here right now, and then I'll have it available after the session.
Okay, and then also if you could put again the name of the sutra book that you showed us.
Yes, okay. So, right.
That would be so great. And I'm going to put my name, right, my email. I'll try to.
Okay, so this is the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, a visual meditation. And so books 1 and 2 by Melissa Townsend. And I'll just put it here on the chat. Here, it's Patanjali, not Pantanjali. And it is available on, the book is available, and the 2 books are available on Amazon. And I'm very pleased that I got them because they're just profound books. So are you able to see the chat, Judith?
Let's see, it says to all the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali by Melissa Townsend.
Yep, that's it.
And then can you see my address? RevJStone@AOL.com.
Wait a minute. I don't think I'm seeing it. So I'm sorry, just let me write it down now.
Because that would get me into Melissa Townsend's, is that
Right.
seminar?
Yeah. Tell me your email address again.
REV as in Reverend J Stone STONE @AOL.com.
Okay, and there was no punctuation in the beginning of that. It's REVJ Stone.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. All right.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
Thank you
it.
so much. Look forward. And anyone else?
I think I may have gone to seminary with Tim Holmes' brother, Steve.
Yes, that's probably right. Steve Garnis Holmes.
Yes, exactly. And I just wrote him a congratulations on his retirement yesterday. But Tim looked so much like Steve, and he had a last name Holmes. And I thought, have I seen that name in the Montana Logging and Ballet Company? And
definitely,
anyway, it was funny. Okay, thank you so much.
That's exactly right. And we actually did a session with Steve Garnis Holmes about several weeks ago. So if you look on the YouTube channel, you can find our conversation with him. And I have to tell you that the benediction he did for us was truly profound. It was the best benediction I ever heard right at the end of that session. So if you just go on the YouTube channel, Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group YouTube channel, and find that link. In fact, I'll send it to you. I have your email address here.
Oh, that's so great. Thank you so much. And I knew Beth, I knew her as Beth Garnis, but Steve and I had so many classes together, and we both did improv. So I knew him better than I knew Beth. She came in a couple years later, I think, but. And
Beth was Steve's wife?
Yes, Beth Garnis. So Steve Garnis Holmes.
Oh, I see.
Both seem like really wonderful people.
Okay.
But thank you so much, and I will look so forward to getting that.
Okay, well, terrific. I'll send that to you right away.
I'll just say, if you have a minute, I just wanted to say one quick thing. I didn't say this to everybody, but for me, what I was taught in seminary is that as we look at the words of the scripture, we don't look at them as a story of fact or history, that they're meaning stories. And they're usually about the collective. They're ratified by the collective. The reason Moses' story isn't because Moses was a great individual. What's important is that story was ratified in the experience of the people. Like an archetypical story.
Yeah. What's the seminary? What seminary?
Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley. And I
Uh-huh.
went to UC Berkeley. I have an undergraduate degree in art before that.
Uh-huh.
But that I understand that to be a mainstream understanding. When I went to seminary in 1979, that was a mainstream understanding of scripture, that it was a meaning history. It was called by our professors called as salvation history. But salvation meant like more like liberation. It's something that gets you out of the narrow places into the wide places of life.
Would you please do a discussion with us one day, sometime soon? I mean, like this, but I'll write to you. I definitely want to have a conversation with you about this, and I think it would be very helpful.
Thank you very much.
So I'll write to you about it and explain why it's so important to me.
Well, thank you. Blessings. I don't usually say yes to these things now that I'm retired, but in this case, I will.
Okay, I'll send you a reason why. For
okay,
sure.
No. I just felt a great love during this of all the things that took me to seminary and, have like infected my life since childhood, a resurgence of that today. But I worked so hard to get out of that role that I had.
Well, I mean, part of my reasoning is the version of Christianity that you just described is not the version that I was brought up with, and I thought that my version was pretty middle of the road because I was brought up in the Navy, and so the Navy chaplains, of course, were at that time at least they were trying to stay in the center of the road in terms of Protestant service and what was being taught in Protestant churches in the Navy, but that's changed now. The fundamentalists have taken over the chaplain corps, unfortunately. But anyway, so we're probably saying too much here, so I'll write to you separately about this.
Okay, great. I appreciate it so much.
Okay, terrific. Nice talking to you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.